Hey, Humanities kids, welcome to another installment of our Renaissance discussion. This discussion is getting us now into the High Renaissance, which is the exciting stuff. This is the big timers. These are the people who we know by name, and you know their images. That's because they're good representatives of the genius that came out of this time. And so all of the evolution we've seen from the Middle Ages through the Renaissance, like this is the peak. And so, some things to look for. First of all, we've talked about systems of perspective, linear perspective. We should see that in getting enhanced. We should see heightened depiction of anatomy, like they're getting better at depicting three-dimensional figures, human figures especially. An emphasis on classical culture, what we saw, and every time we hear classical, we're thinking back to Greece and Rome. So we should be seeing ideas that began with ancient Greece, classical Greece, executed now. And we see artists being elevated no longer as simple craftsmen or, I mean, even though they're still patronized by wealthy people who commission them to do works, artists start to get more of a self-reliant role, or at least with their ability to express themselves. And so we should get to see a little bit more freedom in that area, respect towards artists. And one of our first artists is Leonardo da Vinci, a great example of what it means to be a Renaissance, a high Renaissance thinker and person. The term Renaissance man really comes from Da Vinci because he was so skilled at so many different things. Um, he collected all of his ideas in his notebooks, and so that's how we know what he was interested in. He had interest in plants, animals, humans, natural forces. He pursued inventions. He was into medicine. Like he was pretty much into anything. He was curious. Um, Da Vinci is a good example of one field of thinking that there's balance and order and law that governs nature and art. And as an artist, he believed we could capture that reality through the use of our eyes, through our senses. And that seems pretty basic. Like for most of you, if I asked you to paint something, you would probably look at the thing you wanted to paint. In art class, a lot of times you look at something and use your eyes to gain inspiration for how to paint it realistically. So Da Vinci represents that school of thinking, of approaching art. Michelangelo will look towards some other inspiration, and we'll see that in a bit. So, not surprisingly, Da Vinci values as the best type of painting and art that which exactly imitates the thing itself. So, if you could hold up the real thing and the depiction of it, he wants them to be as close as possible. The appearance matches the reality. So he believed, even though reality is inaccessible to humans, like we only know things through our limited eyesight and we don't see things perfectly, we can get as close as we possibly can by using the gifts we were given, our eyesight and our other senses. So he really values sight as the way to find truth. And that explains why he's so curious about scientific things too, is that he uses experience to guide him. And so if we look a little bit more specifically, here's our first painting from Da Vinci. This is Virgin on the Rocks, of the Rocks. Here you see Virgin Mary at the center, and using this structure that's pretty common at this time, this pyramidal type of structure. So keep looking for that. We've seen it already before. But then you see all of this background and foreground that uses aerial perspective, like we've been talking about, to show depth. Another thing Da Vinci loves to do to show reality is use chiaroscuro, shading, to the extreme. So, like, if you look at this versus Masaccio, like Tribute Money or the Trinity, Da Vinci is seen as an expert because his chiaroscuro is smooth. You could argue Masaccio and the earlier painters were really stark in their contrast, like the dark and the light is really stark and different. But here it's so much more gradual. The shading is much more gradual. Like Mary's hair almost kind of blends in with the background. You can see it, but then there's this pronounced area with drapery, and there's this bright spotlight on faces to add emphasis. But a lot of times there's this kind of smoky quality that is a signature of Da Vinci's. Like if you see that and you don't know who painted it, that's a cue that says it's Da Vinci. The term on your term sheet for that is sfumato. Sfumato. It just means smoky quality, haziness, much more gradual chiaroscuro. And so that is a look at Virgin of the Rocks. Next up, probably Da Vinci's most famous, The Last Supper, which depicts Jesus at the center, focal point. I think we've talked about this. All of the lines, the orthogonals from linear perspective leading towards Jesus at the center. And really, when we talk about high Renaissance, this is a good example. And when we talk about Da Vinci as a Renaissance man, as using sight for guidance, this is clearly based on what a room would really look like. And that structure, that scientific mathematic structure underneath, makes it look real. Also, you can see sfumato here as well. It's the quality of the painting's a little bit rough, but you can tell that this is Da Vinci because of that sfumato, that gradual shading and blending, especially like with the ceiling, with the figures, pretty gradual compared to like Masaccio. You can see aerial perspective too through the windows in the back. And we mentioned this, I think, before too, the idea of the halo, it's still here, but much more realistic than like the gold plate halos that we saw with the Giotto in Unit 4 and we saw with Masaccio in the Trinity, for instance. So that's a little bit about structure. Let's get this out of here. Structure and composition. In terms of message, Da Vinci is also a good example of Renaissance because even though this is a Christian message with Jesus at the center, it's capturing the peak of intensity, which is something the Greeks loved, like get the peak of intensity, the most exciting point. And so here in this narrative, you have Jesus revealing to the disciples in the Last Supper before he's to be crucified that one of them is going to betray him. And so you can see all of the disciples clumped together, wondering who will it be? And it's Judas, we know. But you can see that this is some drama happening, which is definitely a Greek idea executed now in the Renaissance by Da Vinci. Otherwise, I think that's maybe about all for Last Supper. Seating chart is linked here if you want to take a look at who these figures are. But I think that pretty well covers it. The last one I should have mentioned, Last Supper isn't his most famous. Mona Lisa is also really famous. You know this one. High Renaissance for sure. Well, what makes it high Renaissance? What makes this so different from early Renaissance or Middle Ages even? Well, let's use some of the terminology. You can see the gradual shading, not chiaroscuro, but sfumato. You can see in the distance, delicate use of sfumato that adds to that idea of depth and space. Like that looks pretty far away because it's blurry. That would be aerial perspective, atmospheric perspective. Again, classic Da Vinci, like highlighting the face, and just overall a nice job of attention to detail to make this look real and flattering. On that note, this is a different kind of purpose of a painting, an old-timey selfie, if you will. This is a portrait, and portraits became more prevalent in this time period, and we'll keep seeing them come up as we go. Because remember, we talked, this is a time period where people are becoming wealthy. The idea of the feudal system, like oppressing the poor and wealthy people, feudal lords trapping these peasants. Like it's starting to die out as more people move to urban areas. And so people in these urban areas like Florence, Rome, Paris have the ability to commission portraits of themselves. And so it just sort of shows what's happening um, in this time period. I think that's pretty well it for Da Vinci and Mona Lisa. Now, in contrast, a little bit, is the other big hitter from the high Renaissance in Florence, Michelangelo. Michelangelo is important because he kind of presents the other side of where we gain inspiration and insight for art and our understanding of the world. If Da Vinci is all about the scientific method, observe, confirm, depict, right? Use your senses. Michelangelo takes a Neoplatonic view, which is we don't have access to the truth. We're just looking at shadows and copies. So real inspiration comes from inside of us. That's where we get a real inspiration. So he's thinking far better to not trust mathematical procedures, but rather to let let the beauty come out. And so he thinks instead of using the procedures like Da Vinci suggests, he knows something looks beautiful just by looking at it, not the mathematical procedures underneath it. And that maybe seems a little weird, but we'll get into some, we'll show some specifics when we turn to the next slides. On that note, Michelangelo was really valued and popular because people said he had the ability to make man. He could take a block of stone and carve until he found the man underneath, almost like a relief process. So we'll see that when we take a look at some of his sculptures. Michelangelo was commissioned by Pope Julius II, who was nicknamed Il Papa Terribile, the warrior pope. And Julius II really liked Michelangelo's work, so he had him do a lot of different sculptures and paintings. And Julius II got this nickname because he was all about collecting territories and he engaged in war sometimes to get land back. So the idea of who we think a pope is today is a little bit different from what it was back then. One thing you could jot down in your notes too, I think it's a term on your term sheet, is the Terribilita. This is a term that Michelangelo is known for. The idea that he could bring out such extreme emotion from stone or from any work, any medium that he was using. So look for that sublime, awesome, fearful, embodied in stone. And I'll show you some examples of that where they're so real and almost kind of freaky. Okay, let's take a look. Here's our first work from Michelangelo. This is David, and we already talked about David before, Old Testament David, who fought the giant Goliath. And remember, we discussed that Florence loved this story because they were the underdog, and David represented that sort of go-get-'em spirit that Florence wanted to have, or did have. So here, this David's a little bit different. This David, you could say, is definitely high Renaissance because compared to Donatello's David, I don't know if you remember him. Let's do a quick look back here. Okay, here's the first David, Donatello, 1430, early Renaissance. Michelangelo, 1504, high Renaissance. What is different? Well, you can clearly see Michelangelo is inspired by the beauty of man and capturing it thoroughly, I guess you could say. Like if you look at the muscle, the attention to detail, the eyes, this is Terribilita right here. The hands, terribly. To look at those fingers. Like, this is intensity. This is not a kid to be messed with. This David, hmm, I don't know. We mentioned how the head of Goliath is what made it more intense. This David, though, is not one to be messed with. And so I think that's what really defines Michelangelo, the Terribilita. Here, another interesting thing to note, this is a Christian story, a New Testament or Old Testament story, but if you look at the sculpture itself, it definitely reminds you of a Greek sculpture in terms of the beauty of man, and trying to capture the detail. Definitely much more reminiscent. And the pose, even the contrapposto pose, makes this seem advanced. Advanced for sure, back to what we saw in Greece and Rome. Okay, next up, another one that Michelangelo is known for. This is his Pietà, which depicts the Virgin Mary holding Jesus after he's been taken down from the cross, after he's died. So great things happening here too. If you look at like this, pretty amazing. That's stone. If you look at this limp arm, especially contrasted to the strength in this arm here, the veins that you can see, that's a live fighter. This is definitely capturing the emotion of what Christ might have looked like when he died. And so it's pretty phenomenal if you think about it, to be able to capture that kind of detail and emotion in stone. That's why he's one of our big hitters for sure. Um, Other things, you can see the sad emotion on Mary's face, the tension to all the drapery, really fantastic skill that makes him a high Renaissance sculptor. One other thing to mention, this is what separates Michelangelo from Da Vinci a bit. Remember, Da Vinci's all about mathematical proportions, using linear perspective, all of these approaches underneath, these tricks to make it look real. Michelangelo is much more interested in just depicting so that it looks real, but he doesn't follow the rules. So this is a great story that if Mary could actually stand up right now, she would be like, I don't remember if it's 3 times as tall as Jesus, because she needed, like, all underneath here is all the support of stone to support the body of Jesus. But that's not technically how tall she would be. Mary was not a giant. So it just kind of shows that Michelangelo is breaking mathematical rules that Da Vinci valued so much to um, still depict realism. Okay, and that's where we're going to stop. So I appreciate you watching this video. My apologies if it was a little long-winded, but I hope that you have a great day.